One flower, 5,000 guilders, a house on an Amsterdam canal, and the flower was diseased. The bulb never left the ground. The market was paper, traded in taverns. Then, one Tuesday, nobody bid. 90,000 guilders, never paid. The court said, "Sort it out yourselves. The ruined nation, not in the archives." Holland, 1637, back to the flower. Tulips reached Europe from Turkey shortly after 1550 and arrived in the Netherlands in the 1590s. In a flat, gray, extremely rich country, they were the loudest thing anybody had ever grown. Most tulips were one solid color, ordinary, cheap. A few were not. A few had flames, white streaks running through the red, feathered edges, patterns that looked painted on by hand. Those were called broken tulips, and they were the ones people wanted. The problem was that nobody could make one on purpose. You planted a plain bulb, waited a year, and hoped, which means the supply of the most valuable flower in Europe was decided by something nobody understood and nobody controlled. Here is the part the 17th century did not know. The flames were a virus, tulip-breaking virus carried from plant to plant by aphids, switching off the pigment in the petals. The botanist Clusius noticed that the striped ones were smaller, weaker, and less likely to reproduce. He was describing a sick plant. Europe was calling it a masterpiece. Nobody proved the cause until 1928, roughly 290 years after the market for it collapsed. So the supply of the best tulips in the world was capped by a disease nobody could see in a market that only ever wanted more of them. That is a shape you will recognize. A tulip blooms for about a week a year. The rest of the time it is a lump underground, which is an inconvenient thing to build a market on, so the Dutch built one anyway. Growers began selling bulbs that were still in the ground on paper. A note promising delivery in May or June. And the thing about a note is that a note can be sold. So it was. The same bulb changed hands over and over, sometimes several times in a day, and no bulb ever moved. Nothing was dug up, nothing was shipped, nothing was delivered. By the summer of 1636, the trade had its own venue, tavern groups called colleges, with their own rules and their own etiquette. The buyer paid the seller half a stiver out of every contracted guilder, capped at 3 guilders a deal. It was called wine money. It bought the round. So every completed trade ended in a drink, which is a genuinely inspired piece of market design if your main goal is more trades. Bulbs were priced by weight in units called azen. 1 AAS is about 1/20th of a gram. A mature bulb might weigh 50 of them or more than 1,000. So, a market in goods nobody could see, weighed in units nobody could feel, settled in a pub, on credit, months before delivery. It worked beautifully, right up until it didn't. Prices climbed for about 3 years. Then, in the winter of 1636 and 37, they stopped climbing and started jumping. Estimates put the top varieties near 5,000 guilders. For comparison, a master craftsman earned about 300 guilders in a year. 5,000 guilders bought a well-appointed house. So yes, a single bulb really could cost a house. That part of the legend is not a legend, but most tulips were far cheaper, and the enormous prices belonged to a handful of famous varieties. The Semper Augustus was the one everybody painted. Then, around November 1636, something shifted. The trade moved down market. Common bulbs sold by the 1,000 azen, sold by the pound. That is the tell. When a market runs out of the rare thing, it starts selling the ordinary thing at rare thing prices. The steepest rise of the entire story came in the first 5 weeks of 1637. January was the month the numbers went vertical. Everyone in those tavern rooms could see it. Almost nobody wanted to be the person who said it out loud. The first Tuesday of February, 1637. Haarlem, a room that had done this 100 times before. The first lot of bulbs went up for auction, and nothing happened. No bid, not a low bid, no bid at all. The price of a tulip that morning was whatever somebody would pay for it, and that morning, nobody would. News in a market like this travels at the speed of gossip, and gossip in the Dutch Republic moved very fast indeed. Within days, the price structure collapsed almost overnight. Bulbs traded down to somewhere around 1 to 5% of what they had been worth a fortnight earlier. Not down 30%, not down by half, down to a rounding error. And here is the strange thing about a market built on notes. The crash did not take anybody's flowers. The flowers were fine. It took their promises, because the bulbs were still in the ground and the bills were not due until spring, which gave everybody several months to think very hard about their situation. 2 days later in Alkmaar, the most famous auction of the entire mania went ahead exactly as planned. A dealer named Wouter Winkel had died, leaving orphaned children. His bulbs were sold to raise money for them. The hammer prices came to roughly 90,000 guilders. That is the number that turns up in almost every retelling of Tulip Mania. There is one detail that usually gets left out. That is the amount the bulbs would have raised if they had been paid for. The record peak of the world's first speculative bubble is technically an invoice, and the market it was set in had already stopped functioning. 2 days earlier, 40 kilometers away, the Alkmaar auction was not the top of the market. It was a photograph of a price that no longer existed. So the buyers did the obvious thing. They refused to pay. Sellers wanted their contracts honored. Buyers pointed out that the thing they had agreed to buy was now worth almost nothing, and that they had agreed to buy it in a pub. Both of them were right, which is the single worst situation you can hand a legal system. In late February, the growers proposed a settlement. Pay 10% of what you promised and walk away from the rest. The Provincial Court of Holland declined to referee. Its advice was essentially, talk it out among yourselves and please stay out of our courts, which meant there was no mechanism to make anybody pay. A tulip contract turned out to be a promise between neighbors and not very much else. Haarlem eventually set the number itself. Sellers got 3.5% of the contract price. On a 5,000 guilder deal, that is about 175 guilders. Now the part that gets left out of almost every version of this story you have ever heard. The historian Anne Goldgar went through the notarial records of the period, looking for the wreckage everybody assumes was there. She found 37 people who had spent more than 300 guilders on bulbs. 37, in the whole archive. Mostly merchants and skilled artisans, mostly connected to each other already, by family, by religion, by neighborhood. This was a network, not a nation. Then she looked for the bankruptcies. Her finding, in her own words, she found not a single bankrupt in those years who could be identified as somebody dealt the fatal financial blow by Tulip Mania. Nobody drowned themselves in canals either. That image, like most of the good ones, arrived considerably later. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York's own history of the episode lands in the same place. The losses stayed with the people who were in the market. There was no lasting spillover into the real economy. The first great speculative bubble in recorded history mostly ruined a mailing list. So if the ruin is not in the records, where did the ruined nation come from? Partly from the 17th century itself. Pamphlets appeared almost immediately. Satires, moral warnings, cartoons of florists riding a wagon of fools. They were not reporting, they were arguing. The argument was that new money makes people stupid, and a flower was a very convenient way to say it. Then, in 1841, a Scottish journalist called Charles Mackay published Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. He used the pamphlets. The pamphlets became the history. The history became the lesson that gets quoted every time anything goes up in price, which is its own kind of bubble. A story whose value came almost entirely from how many people were repeating it. So here is the honest receipt. A real frenzy, real prices for a small number of people. A real collapse in the first week of February 1637. And a national disaster that was mostly written afterwards. The flower was sick, the market was paper. And the legend was printed 200 years later by somebody selling books. If you like money stories where the number turns out to be a story, hit like and subscribe. There is a new one every week.